can hear me just fine? I'm Chido Sawada, Director of JPRI. That's the Japan Policy Research Institute here at the University of San Francisco's Center for the Pacific Rim. We at JPRI, the Center, and our partner organization, Asia Society, Northern California, were delighted to present a talk and book signing by the distinguished scholar, Frank Dikötter. First, I'd also like to thank our promotional co-sponsors for this evening, the USF Asian Studies Program, the USF Master of Asia Pacific Studies Program, USF History Department, USF Chinese Students and Scholars Association, China Dialogue, and the Fromm Institute for Lifelong Learning. So many co-sponsors on board this evening. Frank Dikötter is Chair Professor of Humanities at the University of Hong Kong and also Professor of the Modern History of China on leave from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. Professor Dikötter has published 9 books that have challenged the ways historians view modern China, from the classic The Discourse of Race in Modern China to Cultures of Confinement, the history of prison in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, Imperfect Conceptions, the history of eugenics in China, Narcotic Culture, a history of drugs in China, and on and on. And tonight, he'll speak to us about his latest book, Mao's Great Famine. After the talk, I hope we can have a spirited question and answer session, and following the Q&A, we'll have a reception and book signing. And in that regard, I'd like to thank Jerry Lloyd of the USF Bookstore for working overtime to make that happen, as well as Kristen Elbers for the reception. So now please join me in welcoming our guest, Professor Frank Dikötter.
Thank you very much for such a generous introduction. I do have one problem here. Normally, I like to drink. That was good. I also like to walk around. So normally I have a clip-on microphone, so my hands are free to walk and drink at the same time. Let me tell you what's going on. My wife and I have been on the road now for about 10 weeks. That's a very long time. When we left, it was the 15th of August in the middle of the summer. Now it's getting very cold. And when we came here in San Francisco this morning, first thing we did, we went for a walk. And we walked through Chinatown. And for the first time in 10 weeks, we really thought, this is home. This is really home. It looks like Hong Kong, it feels like Hong Kong, it even sounds like Hong Kong. So we're absolutely delighted to be here. Now, of course, there are a few differences between San Francisco and Hong Kong. Let me tell you one major difference. The proximity between Hong Kong and the mainland, of course. One of the things you can do when you are in Hong Kong, you can actually take a cab in the morning, a taxi, and go to the railway station, Kowloon Railway Station. You can get your Starbucks coffee, clear customs, get on the train, and 2 hours later, there you are in Canton, Guangzhou, mainland China. It's wonderful. So I did that for a while, starting roughly about 4 or 5 years ago when we first arrived at the University of Hong Kong. So I'd leave on Monday, and by about 9:50, I'd be reading archives in the Guangdong Provincial Archives. I'd be reading archives, and I thought, what do I want to read on? For years, I've been using these archives to look at the period pre-1949. That was the real last frontier, so to speak, that Republican period between 1911, the fall of the empire, and 1949, the conquest of China by Mao Zedong. But I had sensed that for some reason archives were increasingly becoming available on the post-1949 period. So I thought, taking that little train, I thought, why don't I have a look and probe what is going on in these archives? And I was absolutely astonished by the amount of material I found on the 1950s, anything roughly up to the Cultural Revolution that starts in 1966. That's really the big taboo. That's the no-go zone, 1966. I was amazed at how much there was. not just the quantity, but also the quality of the material. And very quickly, I identified a period that, in my eyes as a historian, is extraordinarily important, namely the Great Leap Forward, but which also in the archives seemed to be the kind of zone that was not really very tightly regulated. You see, if you work on the 1950s, immediately after the conquest, an archivist can pick up all the key terms, and they all sound rather negative. I don't know how good your Chinese is, but there are, for instance, a lot of terms that have fan in it. Anti, Su fan, Gen fan, San fan, Wu fan, the anti-5 movement, the anti-3 movement, the anti-terror movement, during which hundreds of thousands of people are executed from 1950 to 52. So one can understand that these terms somehow create some unease among archivists. But not so with the Great Leap Forward that started in 1958 and finished in 1962. It seemed to be very much an area that was quite open to research. So starting in Guangdong Provincial Archives, some 4 or 5 years ago, I spent a good 4 years working in archives, in total 6 months, over a period of 4 years. And what I found completely took me by surprise. 1958 is the Great Leap Forward, Mao's attempt to somehow catapult his country past his competitors, mainly, of course, England. That was the slogan, to overtake England within 15 years, but also the Soviet Union. Here, after all, 1 year before 1958, 1957, the 40th birthday of the October Revolution in Moscow, Khrushchev, the man who has succeeded Stalin. Stalin dies in 1953. Khrushchev, sort of rather rotund little man, prone to making errors. He's the one who slams his shoe at a meeting at the United Nations. Khrushchev proclaims that he will overtake the United States in the production of butter, milk, and other products. So Mao was at the conference in 1957 in Moscow, says, well, you will overtake the United States, we will overtake England. There you go. That's the Great Leap Forward. From that moment on, Mao tries to transform his country into one giant army. The Great Leap Forward is really a leap into communism. And how does Mao want to achieve that? Well, in his eyes, the greatest resource that China has, and no other country can claim, are literally hundreds of millions of people, a massive labor force that could be harnessed and used in a great continuous revolution, using that manpower to move from one task to another, have people in the countryside work on great irrigation schemes in the evening, then come back to till the land in daytime, and over the weekend possibly even increase the amount of steel with backyard furnaces. So his attempt is really to create a giant army. Every man a soldier, that's the slogan. That's how the Great Leap Forward starts in 1958. But the one thing I discovered immediately in the archives, on day 2, were very detailed reports by the Communist Party itself. These are Communist Party archives. Very detailed reports about violence. I knew, we all know, that the Great Leap Forward led to a great famine. That's, after all, the title of the book, Mao's Great Famine. But much more was going on than just famine. And the amount of violence is something that took me by surprise. And I found again and again and again, in archive after archive, whether it was in the south, in Guangdong province, or in arid Gansu up in the north, or Shandong province, or small counties, or cities, countryside, an extraordinary amount of violence used against ordinary people. Now, what do I mean by violence? I mean, for instance, people being punished by beatings, people being drenched in urine for speaking out during a meeting, others being beaten to death by having stolen a potato. People are forced to strip in the middle of the winter and work in the fields. During the summer, they have to stand in the sun and wait till they can't stand it any longer and they collapse. Some people are actually buried alive in a village in Hunan. a man is actually forced to bury his own son alive because that kid has stolen a handful of grain. His father dies of grief after 3 weeks. The case of Wang Ziyo is reported all the way to the top leadership. There's a man who also has stolen one single potato, and for that, his legs are tied up with iron wire. Somebody dumps a 10-kilo stone on his back. One of his ears is chopped off, and finally he's branded with a sizzling tool. You might think that that would be very extreme and an exceptional sort of example that I might just have found after months of looking in the archives. But it was very much everywhere. About 6 to 8% of the people who died unnecessarily during that period from 1958 to 62 were actually summarily executed or tortured to death. So how do you explain that level of violence? I expected famine, not violence. Well, once you start collectivizing the countryside, and this of course was Mao's vision, get rid of private property, get rid of free time, collectivize everybody into one giant army, build up the countryside according to military lines, have public canteens, public dormitories, kindergartens, separate out man from women. But once you start collectivizing the countryside, once people are herded into these giant communes, and every incentive to work has been stripped away from them, the land has been taken away, land was only distributed to them a few years earlier. Their tools are being collectivized, their homes are sometimes confiscated, they have nothing left. There's no incentive for them to produce any work. The cultivator has no reason to go back to the land because the very grain that he grows is taken away by the state in massive procurements. So bit by bit, as the state collectivizes everything, and as famine starts setting in, people see no longer any reason to go out there in the fields and work. And as starvation becomes even greater, increasingly local cadres, party officials on the ground have to actually use a stick to get people into the fields. They have to be beaten to perform work on these giant irrigation schemes, to go to the fields and de-plow or do close cropping or other half-baked schemes devised by the top leadership during the Great Leap Forward in 1958. So what happens here is that when you take away the carrot, when everything is collectivized, when the food is in the hands of the party official and is distributed according to work points, and these work points are poorly allocated, the farmer has no longer any incentive to do anything at all. So in some parts of the countryside, villages and local party officials, cadres, become so brutalized that the scope and extent of coercion has to be constantly expanded, creating a mounting spiral of violence. Now let me move a little bit away from the use of sheer violence to talk about something very closely related to it, yet quite distinct. And that was something else that took me by surprise. Namely, the distinction there is between people starving to death and people being starved to death. Being starved to death. What happens is that while there may be all sorts of ways of punishing ordinary people for speaking out, for falling asleep during a meeting, for stealing a handful of grain, for not quite completing the work schedule, for not turning up on time. While the stick is only one aspect in an arsenal of horror that appears during this period, the easiest way to punish people when all the food is collectivized is actually to ban somebody from the canteen. Pots, tools, kitchen utensils have all been collectivized. Nobody has the right to actually cook outside of a public canteen. The local cadre is not only the man who controls the militia, but also the man who controls the canteen, the food supply. In other words, what I'm trying to say here is that food is used as a weapon. Food is used as a weapon. People who don't work enough don't get fed. But there is a further step. People are too sick, too old, too vulnerable to actually go out there and contribute through their labor to the food supply, are being quite deliberately banned from the canteen too. What we see is the selective killing of groups of people who are seen to be too weak to actually contribute to the building of that great communist future. People in this sort of climate are very much treated like livestock. They have to be housed, they have to be fed, they have to be clothed by the collective. And all of that comes at a cost. And in this climate of digits and quotas and figures, attempts to overtake the Soviet Union, overtake England, produce more steel, produce more grain, or people themselves are being reduced to mere digits on a balance sheet, a resource to be exploited for the greater good in the name of a better future, like coal or grain. The state is everything. The individual, nothing, is worth constantly assessed through work points and reduced to his or her ability to actually move earth or plant rice. So it becomes very tempting when dealing with great shortages. It becomes very tempting for local cadres to actually punish people by not giving them any food. It's called...
Could you hold the microphone a little bit closer to your mouth?
Sure.
Thank you.
It's good up to... I can't hear myself. I hear myself very well, but I can't
About
hear
3 inches.
how much of
We'll hear better. Okay.
It's called performance feeding. The idea that you somehow take away the food from those who don't do enough work, and you give it to feed those who actually excel at fulfilling their quotas. There's a great contradiction. On the one hand, farmers are very reluctant to do anything because there's so few incentives left. Yet on the other hand, the cadres have to fulfill and over-fulfill increasing quotas that they are handed from above. So what you get here is the use of food to deliberately eliminate certain groups of people. In an investigation of a number of counties in Tse-tung province, one leading team that goes to the countryside in 1962 observed that up to 80% of the people who had starved to death had actually been deliberately banned from the canteen as a form of punishment. Lenin actually put it in a nutshell. Lenin was the first one to say something that would have great resonance during the Red Leap Forward. He who does not work shall not eat. He who does not work shall not eat. Very much the same idea. If you can't work, or you won't work, you will not eat. Let me move on a little bit. I've talked about the scope of violence during this period that comes with radical collectivization. I've talked about the use of food to punish people or deliberately starve certain categories of people seen to be unfit or unwilling to contribute. But what about the overall number of people who actually died unnecessarily during this period? Well, as I just said, it is very much the state during this period who reduces people to mere digits. So I'm not one to want to reduce this entire period to a mere theory or to a mere number, how many people died. But it is an important topic, and there's one chapter in the book that uses archival material